a couple of years ago, well, quite a few years ago now, when we set off with the cell and gene therapy Catapult with a mission to try and help the industry industrialize and create growth, we used to go and talk to people who are developing therapeutics and say, you need to think about adoption. You need to think about pricing and reimbursement. And they'd look at us and go, yeah, that's right, that's great. But what we're really concerned about is whether or not we're going to get a hearing with the regulator, whether or not the regulator is going to talk to us seriously. So it's fantastic to hear a presentation like we just heard, where ATMPs are part of the mainstream and part of adoption. It's also fantastic to hear in that presentation talking about pricing and paying for therapeutics. But now we're at a position where actually it's real. People are engaged in that, and this is what we're going to try and talk about this morning. We've got a fantastic panel. We're not going to go through and do introductions. People are going to do introductions as we go along. And we've got 5 topics that we're going to try and cover. And each one of the people is going to introduce that topic. I should say they are actually sitting in the order that they appear on the screen. So you'll be able to match the names quite easily as well. At the end of each topic, or towards the end of each topic, we're going to try and bring questions from the floor. So if you have questions on that particular subject, we are going to move on for it. So try and bring a question in at that point. It'll be very helpful. Right. So let's kick it off. We've got 3 different patterns of questions. The first couple of questions are really about the practicalities. We've got people here who are in the mix of trying to get reimbursed and adoption. So we're going to talk about some of the practicalities of what's happened. The second group are going to try and look forward and say what would be better, and then we're going to try and look at, well, if we have time, look a bit further than that. So let's talk about navigating the HTA process. And Pascal, you've been through that process, or you're in the middle of that process with an advanced therapeutic. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself, tell us a little bit about your organization, and then introduce some of your experience of going through the HTA process in Europe?
Certainly. Good morning, everybody. Pleasure to be with you on the Med after having been with you on the Mesa. I have to admit that the weather on the Med is not as it was on the Mesa, but that's making sure everybody stay in the room over today, discussion there. My name is Pascal Touchon. I'm leading Novartis Oncology efforts in cell and gene activities and therapies, which is mainly around CAR-T today, but we are developing other type of technologies. And the last 9 months have been very active indeed, where since the approval in Europe at the end of August, we were able then to follow on with approval in Switzerland, in Canada, in Australia, and most recently in Japan. So in fact, all the countries in which we have filed for Kymriah in both indication, relapsed refractory pediatric ALL and relapsed refractory DLBCL, we've got approval now. And there were also the countries in which we've conducted global clinical trials. I think that's something I will come back in a moment because that has been very important to have local clinical experience when you go into not only regulatory approval, but also discussion around access for patients, and to have centers that have already managed the complexity and challenges of CAR-T and autologous CAR-T in terms of delivering for patients there. So the key lessons in terms of the most positive one has been around anticipation and a collaborative mindset. And we've started discussing with HTAs and various pricing authorities very early on, and we were very pleased to see how welcoming were these authorities to discuss how this type of therapies could challenge their system and also create new opportunities for patients. The other part was a very collaborative mindset. I mean, we didn't find any payers or health authorities that was not ready to discuss and find solutions for patients. And I think that has been very positive indeed. We didn't see any countries that say, no, we don't want to hear about you, it's not the right time, let's come back in a few years. Everybody wanted to engage, wanted to find solutions adapted to each system. And I think that's one of the challenges we all faced with, that one size doesn't fit all, because there is so many different systems, even in Europe, every system is different. And today, in just 9 months since the European approval, we've already obtained a type of access reimbursement for one or both indication in around 12 countries in Europe. And I think that has been a great achievement already. On top of that, we're also moving forward with Australia recently and Canada and Japan. So it's been very fast level of access and approval there, and it's coming from anticipation and a collaborative mindset. On top of that, we have been trying to find solutions that are innovative in a way to address some of the challenges of ATMP, and particularly CAR-T and Kymriah, which is around having studies that are certainly studies that allows for regulatory approval, but they are relatively short-term follow-up of the patient. There's still uncertainties, and they are open studies with no comparators. So that's part of the need to develop fast this type of therapies. You cannot have studies that are in a typical way with phase 2 and phase 3. You have to come to very significant clinical benefit being evidenced by studies that are not really adapted always to the current HTA system. So how do you address this conundrum? And there's been around this collaboration with healthcare authorities around finding solutions to reduce uncertainties. Most of the HTAs today are anyhow taking uncertainties and, for example, failures into account when they estimate cost effectiveness. But beyond that, for payment, we needed to find a way to address the uncertainties, and that's where risk sharing and outcome-based agreement have been very important. And we find some ways in most of the countries to address this through risk sharing and outcome-based agreement, and that has been very successful. Two particular issues, though, that we faced with. One is when you have one product having two indications, and there are different type of disease, different type of benefit, different type of comparators, it's very challenging within the European HTA system because there is not such thing as indication-based pricing, a product as a price. And I think that's something that we need probably as an industry to lobby for in the future, to have indication-based pricing where you can really look at different indications, different type of disease with the same product, having different type of value there. The second aspect, of course, is the fact that the value that we're proposing there is a long-term value, hopefully a lifetime value. We have 2 years follow-up today showing clear clinical benefit, but it takes time to have more years added to that. And that means that you have to find a way to reduce uncertainties from the beginning, not having yet these 5 years or 10 years type of data that some might want, but then finding risk-sharing and outcome-based agreement to agree on how we're going to follow up not only the efficacy in the clinical studies, but also in real-world type of outcome. And I think Gadoraizi proposed that the EBMT type of partnership is really key there to be able to follow in real life and to make sure that we take our responsibility as an industry to say, we believe that what we saw in the studies is going to be confirmed in real life, but let's prove it. And let's find a way that access is organized around this real-life evidence that is coming there.
Brilliant. Thank you. Really interesting introduction. I mean, for me, it brings home the importance and the power of a large organization in this as well, because you've clearly thrown enormous amounts of resources at the problem. Any points from anybody in terms of this area? We're going to come back on to risk-based pricing and reimbursement mechanisms later, but anything about the HTA process? Any thoughts from anybody? Yeah? You're looking at me, you're going to speak?
No, I'll address it a little bit and get into my bit.
Okay. We'll come back to it later then.
Thank you.
Any questions from the floor with respect to the HTA process and the complexities in Europe? No. Okay, good. We're going to move on. The next question that came up when we were discussing was okay, so there's the complexities of the HTA process and the resources that one needs to put into it. But the next thing that came up as a consistent theme, and as a theme that we see in the work that we do, is actually the readiness of the system itself. The fact that it's not a plug-and-play thing. You don't rock up with a product and expect people to buy it and use it immediately. And we have a couple of people here who have a great deal of experience in that from two sides of the table, if you like. So I'd like to kick off with Dan and said, you know, from your point of view in bringing Luxturna to the market, what's been your experience about the readiness and what you've had to do to prepare the way for the product? Tell us a little bit about yourself and the company as well.
Thanks, Matthew. Good morning, everyone. My name is Dan Faga. I'm the CBO of Spark Therapeutics. Spark's based in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. We're a fully integrated company focused on both discovering and delivering now, meaning we're manufacturing and commercializing a portfolio of AAV gene therapies. But we're also striving to disrupt the chronic treatment paradigm of disease. There's a value in these one-time therapies, potential to have significant outcomes, but for a long period of time for patients, caregivers, and the healthcare system. We're fortunate enough to have the first gene therapy approved in the United States for genetic disease. It's called Luxturna. We actually have our partner represented as well in Novartis outside the United States. That was also approved last year by the EMA in the fourth quarter. And as we think through the challenges of bringing a one-time therapy to market, well, one thing was certain is that for all the innovation in the lab, doing something different and new, it would have been quite unfortunate or almost unacceptable not to ensure that patients had access to these treatments. We've taken upon ourselves, but I think you're going to hear this a lot through the panel today, that the sponsors here need to also be responsible in sharing risk in how we're doing this. As we think about market access, it's critical that when you're looking at these long-term outcomes and the value of the long-term outcomes, we're tying back that responsibility to us. We're sharing in the risk of ensuring that we're going to reduce costs for the system is a principle of ours, but also ensure we're breaking down some of the barriers. So my comments are going to be more specific to U.S. Issues, which is where we've launched the product ourselves. But with market access in the U.S., we have portability issues. It's a fragmented system. Patients jump around. The distribution system is complex and costly. And on the legislative side, there's barriers, specifically price reporting barriers to enabling payments over time. Again, another theme you hear often with these one-time therapies. So we were able to implement, and this took a long time to plan through, a lot of early discussions with payers and other components of the system, particularly on the commercial side. We were able to implement something called the Spark Path, Pioneering Access to Healthcare, which is an innovative distribution and contracting paradigm, which really has two features that are unique. One is we are bypassing the middleman and contracting direct with payers. This avoids risk from the hospital, avoids markups in our buy and bill system that are typical in specialty medicine. And then second, if you opt into this system, you're eligible at the patient level for a rebate. In the short term on efficacy milestones, a few months in, we do a check and eligible for rebate if Luxturna is not working. And then secondly, in the long term, 3 years out, we also look again, and you're eligible for rebate if the medicine is still not performing. This is unique. It's the first time it's happened that we were able to put something like this in place. We want to do more. We're limited in doing more. We'd offer up to 50% rebate if we could. We would collect payments over time. We would look out over 5 years. We know we have the data for it. We're willing to take the risk. And we have proposals in with the CMS, Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, since late 2017 that represent this. I mean, I think there's many people trying to get at the same thing. It's going to require change. It doesn't matter if it's our proposal or others, but we're really looking to put a blueprint in place because all gene therapy is going to face this. We'll talk through this on the panel, including ours, but I think others. So I'll pause there and see if there's any other questions or comments. But looking back over the past year, I think we've had a very successful launch, and hopefully we've sparked something here to look for the ability to do these in the future, and that we may have more medicines coming soon.
Yeah, thank you. If there are any questions from the floor, please indicate. I have a quick question in the interim. In terms of how quickly the time period from deciding to work with a particular centre or with a payer to actually getting through to payment, what sort of time period are we talking about? It's not a 6-month process, presumably.
Well, so in the U.S., I mean, for how politicized and fragmented the system is, we launched pretty quickly. And we were out there treating patients within a few months, 3 months of receiving approval. When we got the approval, we announced an agreement in principle with Harvard Pilgrim, moving towards these ideas, but things came in place, and it wasn't simple. It was the first time we're doing it. A year in, actually really 9 months in, we had 85% coverage in the commercial system, over 50% coverage across Medicaid in the U.S.
Okay, good. Any questions? Janet.
Dan, one of the things we've heard from commercial payers is that they've entered into performance-based contracts on a population level, but doing it at the patient level is really, really hard. Not that they're not interested in doing it, but just as a practical operational matter, it's really challenging on their side. And obviously we know there are challenges for the patients too. So I'm just wondering whether your experience, we've heard that they might be willing to kind of address it with your product because it's a pretty limited population and kind of as a way to test the waters. I'm just wondering if you could expand on that a little bit.
I think that's right. I mean, in some ways, from a system perspective, it's fortunate that Luxturna, it's to treat RP65 mutations, which no one had ever heard of 5 years ago. It's a genetic disorder, it's an inherited retinal disease, of which there's over 200, and many of them look very similar. So it's an ultra-rare population, and allowed us to, exactly like you said, test the waters on this. Patient-level contracting is going to require change if that's the way this is going to happen, or we're going to have to find some broader system. With Luxturna, there was no treatments out on the market for these diseases, so everything was incremental and new. When we think about hemophilia, that's still in development for us, but that's treated today. It's well covered and reimbursed. It's tracked, so we know when patients are getting injections. And while patients have portability, you could start to look at things on a broader basis and assume that there's going to be some transfer. There's a lot to do here on this, but again, there's a blueprint, and then how do you apply it to larger diseases is to be determined.
So we're going to come back to reimbursement in a second, so we'll hold for the reimbursement-based questions. Before we move on to that, I want to stay with this area of actually the readiness of the system, the practicalities of doing it. And Claire, you've got fantastic experience from the UK side. We watched it happen in terms of the very fast, actually, in the end, rollout of CAR-Ts in the UK. Can you tell us something about, and you bring up perspective from the other side, so can you tell us something about yourself, your organisation, which should be familiar to many, and what you actually had to do?
Yeah, okay. Hello everybody, it's great to be here. My name's Claire Foreman. I'm a senior commissioner, health planner, if you like, within NHS England. So the focus of my role is around specialised services in England. Specialised services refers to a list of about 150 services that have been agreed with government ministers as being high cost and low volume and therefore appropriate for national planning. I'm also really fortunate to currently be on a secondment working with the Cell and Gene Therapy Catapult on a kind of collaborative project to understand perspectives better on how we can, the whole system and all stakeholders need to work together around facilitating adoption of ATMPs. As Matthew said, my role was involved around preparing the services for the introduction of the first two CAR-T products, which were approved and recommended by NICE for reimbursement through the Cancer Drugs Fund. So my perspective is a bit of a gear shift in terms of the focus on services, because I think the opening speech made reference to the fact that, these are technically classified as medicines, but actually in real life experience, they seem anything but medicines. So there's lots of work needed to do to prepare services in the run-up to products being approved and recommended and getting services out to patients. So what did we do? Well, I led the work around this, and frankly, we did a lot of things. I don't have enough time to tell you all of them. Maybe over the breaks, over the next couple of days, I'll get to speak to you more. But I think probably two key things that felt different to how we would normally go about preparing for the introduction of an approved drug. So the first was that we had to not treat it like a drug. We had to effectively treat it exactly as if we were planning a service. And when we plan a service, as the responsible commissioner in England for this list of 150-odd services, it takes a lot of work, a lot of lead-in time. And so we had to work well in advance. We probably started the planning more than a year in advance of when we thought these medicines were going to be hitting us. We worked with all of the stakeholders in order that we could understand all of the perspectives, understand in absolute minute detail the end-to-end pathway, including how the new pathway would differ from existing pathways for clinical services. And actually understanding fully the roles and responsibilities of all of the players in this new technology development, particularly given the role of hospitals in manufacturing this medicine for the benefit of patients. I think the second thing that we did, which was a bit different, was that we had to really flex our timelines and our usual processes in order that we could make sure that access for patients was delivered as close to authorisation and approval as possible. In England, the arrangements are that NICE, who undertake the health technology appraisals, when a drug is approved, then there's anything up to 90 days for the whole system to prepare for that implementation. That would be intolerable in the case of the CAR-T experience that we had. So it was really necessary that we understood early on and began early to plan together how we would be ready, if you like, from day zero. In terms of reflecting on what we've learned from all of that, I think the CAR-T experience for us in England has been, if you like, illustrative, but it won't be instructive for all of the other ATMPs to come. There are clearly going to be key differences, not only in other CAR-Ts, but also in some of the other ATMPs that we'll be seeing coming. But I suppose the key thing that will be the same is that we will need to collaborate, and we will need to do that early. You know, it took a lot of people, a lot of hard work to achieve what we have achieved in terms of access to CAR-T therapies in England. None of us, I think, whichever stakeholder group you're in, have the resources to replicate that every single time we have a treatment. So we need to work together to, if you like, take stock, learn as we go, and really reflect on how we can sort of build more efficiency into the process. That's the efficiency from the payer side in terms of our processes, of how we work together with people. But also I think there's something around the efficiency of the technologies that are coming through in the pipeline, so that we really focus on how can we, if you like, remove any of the additional barriers in terms of really getting accelerated access for patients where products are recommended and approved.
Thank you, Claire. I mean, a couple of points that I would sort of hammer home on that. One is the enormity of the preparation work that needs to go on from the hospital side. But the other is the amount of detail and what the implications of that is if you are repeating it for a number of products coming through. But we will come back to that subject a little bit later. Does anybody want to add to any experience? Pascal.
Yeah, maybe to comment what the NHS has done, because there's been really a plan in advance, and anticipation has been really the true aspect of it. And a very collaborative mindset indeed. And the fact that we managed to find an agreement for the first indication of Kymriah PDLL within 10 days following the EU Commission approval has been quite remarkable there. So we could then deliver for these kids in need of a transformative treatment. So thank you for that.
Interesting. Thank you. Good. Right. Now we're going to come on to a subject which came up consistently with everybody that we spoke to and comes up every time. The burning question of actually the mechanisms for getting paid. Alison, at Bluebird, earlier on in the year, you introduced a model for how you would go about approaching the marketplace, which has a lot of consideration behind it. Tell us about yourself, tell us about Bluebird, but tell us about that model and what you were trying to achieve with that, and then how it's been received.
Yep, thank you very much. So my name's Alison Finger. I'm the Chief Commercial Officer at Bluebird Bio. I've been here almost approaching 4 years, and it's been 4 years of a lot of work getting us up to the point where we're at right now. When Janet did her introductions this morning, she noted that we had positive CHMP opinion for our first product here in Europe last month, and so we're working very tirelessly and around the clock to be ready for hopefully our first approval shortly. Bluebird Bio is a cell and gene therapy company. We have technology platforms across both lentiviral vectors and also gene editing technologies. And we also have in our pipeline, we have 4 late-stage products. Our Zynteglo for beta thalassemia. We also have lentiglobin in clinical development for sickle cell. We have a program for cerebral adrenoleukodystrophy. And then we're also partnered with Celgene for our BCMA CAR T technology. So a lot going on back at the ranch at Bluebird, but as you noted, we've been thinking a lot about some of the issues that some of my fellow panelists have talked about already in terms of how we think about access and getting access for these products. And as noted, the systems today are really set up to address chronic therapies. And with chronic therapies also is the implied assumption of chronic payment. With our technologies and with gene therapy, we're hoping for a lifetime of benefits with a single intervention. So this sort of dichotomy between these two paradigms is what we've been thinking about how we solve. And we also recognize at Bluebird this isn't something that we can just solve on our own and do in an ivory tower. We actually have to do it working with the stakeholders and working with payers and working with really all the stakeholders who are looking to bring these types of benefits to patients in need. And so when we think about it, what we really feel is the best approach is to think about how we partner with payers and partner with stakeholders to do this. And really the risk-sharing approach is one that we very much put on the table at the beginning of this year, and also looking at solving the problem of the two paradigms, looking at how could you do have payment over time. And at Bluebird, we're thinking about what we said earlier this year is that we would enter into risk-sharing agreements with payers based on outcomes, putting really up to 80% of the value at risk because we would cap the cost of the therapy over 5 years. And so what you're really looking at is delivering a lifetime of benefit with cost capped at 5 years. And so that was the model that we put forward earlier this year at JP Morgan. What's really interesting is the amount of discussion that came out immediately when our CEO talked about this at JP Morgan. And I think a lot of other people have been working on different parts of this, and my colleagues have already noted things that they've done, and we're watching very closely what happens with Novartis and what happens with Spark. And our hats are off to you in terms of some of the pilots and the work that you're doing. I think that it is very much a situation by situation as we've gone out and engaged with payers across Europe, and then also thinking about how this is going to work in the US. Obviously, as I said, we watch what our colleagues are doing, but also talking to each one of the payers and thinking about what are the specific solutions that are needed. What I'm incredibly encouraged about is the amount of engagement and the willingness and the discussion of let's put a pilot program together, let's figure this out. And so we don't have all the answers yet, but we have people at the table, and that's what's really gratifying at this point. So more to come.
Okay. Anybody want to add from their experience, Pascal, in terms of reimbursement?
Well, I would like to share that the pioneer in the field, like Bluebird, Spark, ourselves, and Novartis, we're really there to support also the effort of what you are doing in other companies in earlier phase of development, which is to clarify the landscape and the different innovative solutions that we can bring. So all these innovative solutions will help the industry at large in finding a way to address some uncertainties, but also two particular aspects. One is we still don't have the right type of model to value this type of therapies that have potentially lifetime benefit. And the current HTA models have a shorter time of follow-up, like 7 years or 9 years, not a lifetime follow-up there. So we need to work with the expert in terms of finding the right model there. And then from the payment, as has been done by Bluebird and Spark in the US, and ourselves with Luxturna in Europe as well, find solutions that are addressing the payment challenges where you have this value that is going to progressively uncover over a lifetime. So how do you plan the payment there, and how do you take into account the budget situations of the healthcare authorities and budget there in terms of national payers, but also private payers as well? Private payers are more challenging because there is the issue of the patient moving from private payers to private payers, whereas with national payers, at least in most cases, you can engage on the long-term follow-up and installment in payment or with sharing or different type of approaches there. But the most important that what we're doing with all these pioneers is really to try to find innovative solutions that could be then applicable to all these ATMPs moving forward.
Dan, did you want to?
Yeah, so I'll second the early engagement and the partnership points. It's interesting to reflect back on where we were a year and a half ago, 2 years ago. Everyone's in it together. I was making a point around if we don't ensure access to patients, we've all failed. And I think there was a joint responsibility in that. It doesn't make it easy. The contracting process was exceptionally difficult. It still is difficult. But there was at least the right motivations around the table with patient groups, with the payers, to do something different. And I think that goodwill is still radiating through. There's a shared responsibility that's being recognized across the system.
Owen, did you want to add anything on this subject at this point? So I have a question for all three of you that are sort of in the practice of risk-sharing models, if you like. How are you finding the situation with respect to the infrastructure in place? It's all very well saying that we're going to pay you over 5 years, but how are you keeping that information? Is the infrastructure there for you to follow the patients and for you to be able to verify that the appropriate clinical effect has actually taken place or persisted?
Well, you need it. You need endpoints that are measurable and that are simple. With Luxturna, our phase 3 trial was a mobility test. That is not practical to do in a real-world setting across multiple sites and to track. We had to correlate to a more specific outcome called the FST measurement. But I think one of the major issues that you start to think through, and you will think through again earlier next time, is in the contracting process, whose responsibility is it for the patient to continue to be tracked? In some diseases, this will be easier than others. With Luxturna, if a patient now is able to see what's their motivation to come back in 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, that's a challenge, and who's going to bear that risk? Now, you could also sit here and say, well, if they're not coming back, they're probably okay. That's a nice way for the sponsor to think about it.
It's interesting payment decision. They're probably okay.
But it is something that we have to work through. Yeah. And every payer, while there's similarities, there's nuances across the board.
And I think that becomes more acute with a larger population that's even
yes.
Alison,
yeah. So I think it is really interesting. I think when we've engaged with payers both in the United States and with Europe, one of the things that they say, not surprising, is make sure it's something that's relevant to us. And that is, of course, very important. For us, for Zynteglo, and what we're looking at, our endpoint is transfusion independent. So it's a very elegant way and an elegant way to think about this with the risk-sharing agreements. And actually, when you're thinking about transfusions and taking care of these patients, where the data, whether the data comes from us or actually comes from the payer themselves, being able to track transfusions is actually pretty simple. So again, it's a nice blueprint, as you noted before, for us to move forward with, and making sure that all of that is in place. But I think it's going to be therapy by therapy, because you have to be, it has to be the specific endpoints for that therapy and the endpoints that are easily tracked and relevant not only for us but also especially to the stakeholders that we're working with.
Interesting that you say it's simple. To track that data.
The contracting is not necessarily simple, but the endpoint is nice and elegant.
Right,
it's done
today.
You
know what you're looking for, you just got to find it.
Yes.
It's done today. In hemophilia, if a patient bleeds, they're taking a factor. It's done today.
Somehow you've got to get that information back to the payer and have it verified and trustable as information.
Yes.
But Claire, you were going to.
I just wanted to make a small additional point, which is that not only are some of the things that Dan talked about really important in terms of the mechanisms that would support any kind of risk sharing, actually payers are really interested in knowing upfront how the overall delivery of care is going to work in future for these patients. We know that although the ATMPs that we're talking about will be transformative in one particular area, there will still be a requirement, not least in terms of the regulatory requirements, for these patients to continue to be followed up in services. So it's not a small point, just in terms of the patient journey and the patient experience and outcomes, as well as the considerations for financing.
Interesting. Pascal, you...
So in Europe, we've experienced 3 different types of situation and agreement. One is patient-based. So when you have the structure in a country that allows to follow every individual patient, then you can have an agreement based on patient individual cases, where you have a part of risk sharing depending on what type of outcome you get in that particular patient. And we have a few countries with whom we've done that. A few other countries don't want that because it's a bit too burdensome for the system, and they prefer to look at the population of patients within the indication within their country. So we have an agreement about what type of outcome we want to reach based on our clinical data in that population, in that particular country, and then they follow that. And it's not, they might lose a patient or two in terms of follow-up, but altogether, they see that their data is then, the real-world data is then confirming the assumption that have been made in the agreement. And the third case are countries that don't want to go into that for various reasons, and they just want to have confirmation about your benefit as per your clinical trials with time. So they just want to say, okay, fine, we're going to do that, but when you come with 3 years or 5 years, 10 years data, you don't have evidence that you have that level of response, of complete response, for example, then there will be some risk sharing there. So these are the 3 situations we've encountered in Europe. And as usual, as I said, one size doesn't fit all. You need to be ready to discuss any type of situation depending on the structure of the healthcare system, as well as the willingness of the payers to engage in something that is another burden for them in terms of follow-up of the patients.
And in all of your minds, who is actually going to be responsible for gathering that data? And who's going to make sure that that data is reliable for everybody that has to use it? Because both sides, there's the payer and the manufacturer. If you're sharing risk, you've both got to be confident in the data. So who's going to be the best party to gather and verify that data?
I mean, when you are at the individual patient level, it's the hospital. I think that's what we have in the US, for example, in pediatric ALL. I mean, we don't bill the hospital if they tell us that they have not obtained complete remission after 1 month. So that's very clear-cut type of exchange of information there. That's very clear. So when you are at the individual-based level, is the hospital. When you are at the population, it has to be the payers showing data that are confirming or not confirming what we see in clinical trials or the basis of the agreement we have with them. So that depends very much whether it's individual-based or it's population-based.
Interesting. Anybody have a different perspective on that? Oh.
Yeah, I think there's a risk that things split into 2 different areas. So you get general therapy area registries, for example, that would be run by clinicians or groups of clinicians. And we've seen that historically in pulmonary arterial hypertension, for example. It's very good, but it's run in those sorts of areas. And then separately, you'll then have technology-specific requirements that come out of the regulatory requirements. And I think you start to get parallel tracks. And the real risk is that left in that default way, you don't get the synergies of trying to look at common platforms that would be able to more efficiently collect those data and interpret them more rapidly. So that's the risk, is that you just get an inefficient organic solution as opposed to one that's more considered and strategically thought through.
Interesting. Alison.
Yeah, so this is obviously something that we're spending a lot of time talking to our potential risk-sharing partners with, and it's interesting because there are differences of opinion. There's some people who say, you show us the data, and there's also people who say, no, thank you, we want to use our own data. So not surprisingly, we are going to have registries for our products, but also not surprisingly, when you talk to some of the payers, as I said before, they have their own patient records, and they know when a patient is going to need a transfusion or has a transfusion. So we're working through all this right now, but different people are coming from different places on it.
I think, for us in our work, this is something that we see as an impending problem. I think when it's okay when you're doing things on a small scale, as we are doing now, you can do it manually. You can say, is the patient still there? Is the leukemia is the patient still alive? But when you're talking about an introduction of tens of thousands of therapeutics into the marketplace, I'm not sure how this is going to work. And this plays on another subject, which brings me on to Owen in terms of, again, in the work that we've seen the hospital system creaking at the demands of manufacturers about what they will need in the future. And we've also seen manufacturers saying, we need to get there first, we'll get our infrastructure in place, and then we'll have some degree of defensibility of our product in the hospital system. And I think this is an open debate, but Owen, can you take us through this thought process about whether or not the industry needs to come together in some way, shape or form with the infrastructure, or whether or not having a proprietary platform is in fact the way forward because that's a source of strategic advantage?
Thanks, Matthew. So, morning, everyone. My name's Owen Marks. I lead the rare disease unit for Pfizer in the UK. But I guess the relevant experience was that 3 years ago, before I was asked to set the business unit up, I'd spent 5 years running international marketing commercial teams in Italy and before that in France. And we were looking at the time at these new technologies just with great excitement. I mean, we were like an echo chamber of people looking at the technology and thinking about what it could bring, and we could just see the sort of opportunities come through. And in the past sort of 3 years, we've really switched to be at the discussion level with stakeholders, in my case in the UK, but I'm sure it's very similar in other countries. And then you start to see the opportunity to agree some real common platform areas where we can work together to accelerate the uptake of these treatments in a way that's compatible with the healthcare systems, patient need, and clinician expertise, as opposed to let a system organically develop that in fact is inefficient and has many barriers to the uptake. So to give you an example, we've been working with a number of stakeholders, and we met with a Fabry's team who had been obviously delighted that they could see the treatments of ERTs come through and subsequent treatments, great news. But the first thing they said is it's really complicated to have a completely different set of forms of requirements for each of the three, in their case, 3 treatments that they monitored. And so you see the charts earlier. Arm themselves over the past 3 years have published a number of clinical trials ongoing, and 3 years ago it was 700 or so. It was 2 years ago it was 850, and we've just seen that it's now 1,000. You start to, even with the attrition that we'll inevitably see, you start to put those numbers in, and then you think that the system is already telling you that 3 treatments is very bureaucratic to be able to run. So luckily we started to the point about earlier engagement. We'd been working with NHS England, and NHS England had suggested they were really open to having an ATMP round table. That sort of multi-stakeholder group looking at what could and should be a platform approach to these technologies and what stays proprietary. So, of course, both Dan and Alison's described earlier what must be specific to that new innovation and must be specific to that therapy area. But if there are areas where we can have registries that operate on a common platform, that collect information on an outcomes basis, that follow patients up in a common way, these are all beneficial to the patients who ultimately need to have these treatments. And we were struck by, and in this round table, of course, you've got NHS England, NICE, the Catapult, and all of the industry players. So the real reflection is it's not going to be easy at all. But if we don't, and we think of parallel industries, we think of electric cars. Until electric cars have a common platform for charging, they will never be used as rapidly as they could. We don't use a different proprietary internal combustion fuel supply for each car we have. It would seem like madness. So I think as challenging as it is to reconcile, especially when we're so focused on bringing our technologies to market, we have to think about what could be common and therefore could take inefficiency out of this system. That, you know, cost and affordability is already a question. Let's not have things that make that worse in terms of duplication. So I think that's a lot of ongoing work, and I know different countries are at different levels, but to make sure that we get the interface to get that to work well with all stakeholders is easy to say and it's hard to do, but it's a very worthwhile effort.
Claire, did you want to give a healthcare?
Absolutely. I mean, I have to just emphasise from a payer's perspective how important that perspective really is. You know, if I reflect on what's happening in the NHS, you know, we're at a time where effectively there's a real push for efficiency, for greater digitisation. You know, people have been told to get rid of their fax machines, the concept of, you know, new treatments. And yes, these are really important treatments, but there will be other treatments still going on for patients, all those patients who unfortunately won't be eligible for these ATMPs. And the same clinical teams often will have to be managing all of this complexity on the front line. And when we think about how health systems have often spent quite a long time trying to come up with standardised procedures to avoid clinical errors, and to maintain safety and quality, it's really, really important that we don't lose that important principle and concept as we move forward. So I think payers are very interested to see what they can do to help and encourage manufacturers think about how they can collaborate and work together to address this potential barrier.
Alison? You didn't have one. So I have a question for you then. Okay, so we think it'd be great if everybody was on a standardized platform. Is that actually practical? How could it work? I mean, how would the industry get to a point where they were taking a common interface to the healthcare?
Is it practical?
Is it practical?
Well, I think it's inevitable.
How? How do you see it evolving? Because if people want to join in with that process.
Yeah, sure. So what I mean is, if you think about the numbers we talked about earlier, at some point, health systems will say, this is ridiculous. We're not going to run hundreds of different systems for all of your different technologies. And so inevitably what will happen is that there'll just be a stop. We're doing it this way, and now whether you need to comply with this sort of common platform of registries, of collecting information, of follow-ups, of outreach to patients, all that kind of stuff. So if that's going to happen anyway, and the longer you spend time talking to people in this space focused on the area, the clearer that becomes. And it's just a question of whether or not you can speed that up, and you can do it before there's a crisis in anticipation of that. And I think it's a question of just being very specific and selective about what those areas are, not trying to say that everything's a common platform. Of course it's not. But if we have ATTCs, advanced centres, looking at delivery of gene therapy, and as a roundtable group, we consider that we can see that they'll have multiple tens, possibly hundreds of different therapies that they need to take care of, then we can see already that there are some key areas, and I think that's where you require leadership in stakeholders. So whether it's industry leadership or it's leadership in terms of health systems or groups such as Catapult, if people have that vision and they can collect their thoughts and work on it, then I think it brings the inevitable forward, and the only people who benefit from that are patients.
And I think whatever solution is brought up has to be, I mean, Catapult has a role to play, but it has to be a global solution. It has to be something that's globally compatible as well. So I think there's probably a role for ARM here as well.
I would just say this is the way the innovation cycle is supposed to work. Right? We're innovating in commercial models and reimbursement systems, no different than these technologies are innovative. And we're going to have different systems. With what, Alison, you presented out on Bluebird, what you're thinking is there's a lot of similarity. We're talking about trying to do at Spark. There's differences. We're going to try a bunch of different things with these early therapies, and at some point things will coalesce to a system that works. I think you have to believe that. 2-3 years ago, you think back to where we were at Spark, there was enormous challenges to think about launching a gene therapy. And there have been other gene therapies, none of them have launched well. And so, this is just the process. And I have a lot of confidence that in a few years, as more of these come to market, we'll try a few different approaches, and you should probably coalesce to a couple.
Interesting. Any questions from the floor at all on any of the subjects? No? Then we're going to move on. We're going to move on to a slightly more broad, forward-looking subject, which is open to everybody to discuss, if you like. And it's something that comes up a lot, which is about the readiness of the wider community to pick up on the industry that we're bringing forward. I think it's fantastic to see the EMA presentation earlier on, which treated what we're doing like it's sort of almost a routine part of life now. And that's because we're inside of our own discussion. We're talking about something that we're now very, very familiar with. But is everybody else there too? Is everybody else ready for this radical change to the healthcare system? I don't know if anybody's got any perspectives on Owen or Alison.
Yeah, I'd love to jump in here. I think this is it's fascinating, and it's something that I was so excited to come and get to work on at Bluebird, just in terms of the monumental change that's ahead of us, and what it means to bring these types of therapies into the clinical practice, and into the medical paradigm. There is so much change that is needed, and we've been talking about it. Not only from a payer, but from an infrastructure standpoint, from the sites themselves and just the care delivery for a patient. But also, I think what's interesting is to make sure that we're not just talking in our own bubble, and that we're talking about and thinking about what it means to people in the general population too. And I know there's a lot of work with the ARM Foundation, and I'm lucky enough to work with the ARM Foundation, but on behalf of this entire group and what every company is doing, just in terms of the education that is needed from the lay public to the treating physicians. For us, we're looking obviously at the sites that are actually going to deliver gene therapy. We're also looking at all the hematologists who are treating transfusion-dependent thalassemia today and what this means for them. And how close they are, how proximal they are to gene therapy or not, and the education that's needed. And then, of course, with the patients, the advocates, and then the lay patients themselves. So just a tremendous amount of change coming, and with that comes really the responsibility for clear and deliberate education from some of the most basic principles, but all the way to the most technical. And it really is a huge responsibility for all of us, and something that we're spending a lot of time thinking about.
Interesting. Pascal.
And maybe 3 additional points. One is a lot of work to do to get the physicians and the team in hospitals ready for that. And it's interesting because in the US, and we see that in Europe right now, we're working with transplant centers, and they have to evolve from being transplant centers to be transplant and cell therapy centers. And I think that has been a lot of evolution in the way they are organized. And now many of them are really anticipating that and getting ready in saying this is not only 2 products right now, but there are many more coming. So we need to get organized within the hospitals to manage these cell therapies. The second is around the media. There have been a lot of misunderstanding regarding price, because price has a kind of sticker shock element into it with this transformative one-time therapy. And so to explain what does that mean, that when you have to compare with other interventions like chronic treatment for years, like in multiple myeloma, for example, very expensive one, or other alternative therapies or possibilities like stem cell transplant that cost also a lot of money to the system. So the price is something that has to be put in comparison with the other intervention and also the benefit you get. So moving from price to value has been an element of a readiness of the various communities and stakeholders to accept that. And the third aspect are the patients in 2 ways. I think the patient, we see patients so excited by what they hear sometimes that they want to get a CAR T. And their indication, and they are not within the indication, or they are not eligible for CAR T. But they heard about it, so they want to get a CAR T. So there's a need also to educate through the physicians, the patient community, and through also patient association that play a very significant role there to make sure that they understand what it is exactly and when and how they could benefit from that, or at least when and how they need to talk to their doctors, their physician, to get the benefit of it. Maybe that's three aspects of readiness of the various stakeholders that needs to be upgraded or improved there.
And who is going to transfer all of this information? Is it each individual company that's going to be out lobbying? Or
no, I think both. But individual companies are doing a lot when they are the pioneer, like our company is represented here, and we are working together there. But there is a need also to have pan-industry type of organization like ARM that is playing a very significant role, discussing also in specific countries with the health authorities, with the payers, to make sure that the communication is handled in a proper way, and of course with the hospital and physicians.
Owen, you would just...
Yeah, so I think that's true. So I'd agree with Pascal. I think that industry needs to contribute to that initiative to communicate with media and get the appropriate messages to the general public. But they can't lead it. I think that needs to be led by groups like ARM, Catapult, and others. But I think one of the other real considerations around the general public and patients is to be very aware of, if you're not familiar with this space, the kind of fear that people can have. So it's very easy for people to start to consider what they consider the challenges might be in this area, and if we're not careful, we're so focused on what we see as the clear, undeniable benefits that we don't see, if you know a little less about this, what your suspicion might be, and it can vary. So in an area where there is absolutely no treatment whatsoever, then people's level of appetite to get involved in trials and get treatment is huge. In areas where you're really improving existing treatments, you actually have a completely different group to work with. There may be suspicion. In the area of haemophilia, for example, factor concentrates derived through plasma some time ago killed patients with haemophilia. So there's a level of suspicion in that patient group that doesn't exist in other areas. So I think we've got to tailor that and really think about how it comes across from their perspective, not just ours. And then the only other point I was going to make is just making sure that systems with this early collaboration have time to adapt. So if one of the key benefits in potentially curative therapies is that you don't need any longer what you used to have to provide chronically, what happens to those systems? What happens to those people who are employed doing that? What happens to those clinics? All of that kind of stuff. If people have enough time to plan for that, then you don't get the kind of barriers to uptake that could otherwise exist. And that sort of system anticipation of these benefits needs to give time so that people can retrain and they can work in different areas so that systems actually get the full benefit of what we're bringing.
I think that's really interesting. I think there was an implication of competition from Pascal amongst different clinical groups of products and things like that. Claire, you were going to ask.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the key things to build on from what Pascal and Owen has said it is around that service planning. So whilst these treatments will be transformative at an individual level, they are their whole intention, and if we're going to optimise their potential value, it will also be about recognising the impact that they're going to have on the services. Now, different health systems will have a different approach to how that's planned for. In England, in systems where it's a publicly funded health system, it won't be the hospitals who will be at the forefront of doing those planning pieces around how services need to change. So it will be important that people realise that, and where that's necessary, engage with the payers who are effectively health planners and will be doing a lot of that work. One other thing I wanted to just say was that on the communications piece, we worked really closely not only with the companies but also with the charities and the patient groups around how we could actually bring together some of the key messaging to ensure that we managed some of those, to get the right balance between expectation but also some of the fears.
Thank you. Okay, so we're down under the last 2 minutes now, so I'm going to ask each of the panelists, if they have one, just to throw out a parting thought that they'd like, from their experience, you to take with you to make your life a little easier going forward, and then I'll do a quick summing up. So if we go down the line, Dan?
Sure. Outcomes-based arrangements are going nowhere. You're looking at a group of panelists here that are willing to share in risk, and I think a prediction here would be ultimately will be required to share in risk to make these therapies come to market in mass.
Thank you.
I guess the most important thing I can say is very simple, and that's start early and think through all the change that has to happen and what you're going to do to make it happen. But you know, it's not something that you can do just a year before launch, right?
Thank you. Claire.
As disruptive as we want these to be in terms of patient outcomes, I'd like to work together to ensure that they are minimally disruptive when it comes to the service planning elements, or where we know they're going to be really, really disruptive, then, as Alison says, we need to start work early to plan that together.
Owen?
It sort of builds on that, actually. So we have at our fingertips an unprecedented degree of innovation, and I think collaboration is a word that's often used in a very soft way, but I don't think it's like that at all. It's going to be extraordinarily challenging, but it does not mean we must not work collaboratively to make sure that the unprecedented benefit is ultimately what is realized.
And Pascal?
I'm very optimistic. I think we've already proven that working in collaboration with regulators, payers, and hospitals, we've been able to deliver Kymriah to hundreds of patients across the globe. So that's working. Now, the question for the industry is how do we deliver to thousands, tens of thousands, or even more in even more countries? And I think that's where we have to work together, learn from this experience, and develop some cross-company and with other stakeholders collaboration to move to another stage when all of these beautiful therapies are being developed are coming to the market.
Brilliant. Thank you. Right. So very quickly, you know, we've heard a number of things. We've heard that actually HTA is possible. It's working at a local level within Europe. We've heard that from an infrastructural point of view, there's an enormous amount of planning to be done and preparation, and bear in mind the changes that are needed in the healthcare system itself. We've heard that surprisingly, a large amount of people are putting forward reimbursement-based models, and there's a lot of work to go through on that. We've heard a call for some degree of harmonization, some degree of convergence by the industry so that we get the GSM effect or whatever effect you want to have in terms of building a fast-moving industry. And we've heard that we need to work closely with the wider community to make sure that they're also ready for what we would believe in so much. And with that, I would like to thank the audience for your participation, but also the panel for all the work they've put in. Thank you very much.